Thank you so much to our speakers again for offering sometimes a differing perspective on what China's intentions and ambitions are, and also how China's rise is impacting the geopolitical landscape. Our next segment is a very exclusive video conversation about the diplomatic answer to the China challenge. In this video conversation, we have Jon Huntsman, who served as U.S. ambassador to China from 2009 to 2011, in conversation with current ambassador to China, Nicholas Burns. And he joined us from Beijing. So please take a look.
So, Ambassador Burns, it's such a pleasure to see you. And I'll bet you can't remember the last time we were together talking about China.
92nd Street Y in New York City. When you were ambassador, John.
It was New York City. Yeah, it's a few years ago. And it was a role reversal because you were interviewing me for that one. And we had a lot of fun. It was terrific. Really enjoyed it. Well, it's such a pleasure to be with you. And you know the state of Utah where we are convening this conference. Your brother works for the Department of Transportation. You've followed the state. We've been friends for a number of years. We've got the World Trade Center in Utah, which is the major convener for this conference. And no surprise, there's tremendous interest in the topic. And who better to kind of help us understand where we are than you, Nick Burns, the current U.S. ambassador to China. Nick, you've had an absolutely stellar career. You previously were professor of diplomacy and international politics at Harvard. I think I saw you once or twice there during your illustrious tenure. You served as the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs. And I think that's maybe where we first met, which is really the senior foreign service slot within the State Department until Bill Burns became deputy. And you've also served as U.S. ambassador to NATO, U.S. ambassador to Greece, senior director at the National Security Council for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasian affairs. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. And now you find yourself in Beijing. So there's no other person on the face of the earth who has their finger on the pulse of the U.S. China relationship quite like you. And I found that you're in an indispensable position on both sides because you're explaining the United States to Chinese audiences and you're explaining China to American audiences, and you're doing your best to try to help people understand what sometimes is a great chasm, a great divide between us. But walk us through a little bit where you see the current state of play between the United States and China, this being really the 50th anniversary of the Shanghai Communique, where over the years we've seen a lot of ups and downs, and now we're kind of redefining the whole state of the bilateral relationship. Where do you think we are?
Well, John, thank you. And first, before I answer your very good question, I just wanted to send greetings to you. You are so well remembered here at the American mission in China, which you led so brilliantly when you were ambassador here, and well remembered by the Chinese as well. So thank you for that. And thank you for your long service to our country and as governor of Utah, but also as ambassador 3 times to 3 of the most important countries in the world, Singapore, Russia, and the People's Republic of China. I really salute your public service.
Can I say that I was inspired by you, Nick?
I think it's the other way around. I've always been inspired by your devotion to the public realm and public service, and we need more people like you. So I was delighted to get this invitation. And as you know, I would have preferred to be in Utah. My brother Stan's been living there since the 1970s. He loves the state. We go hiking in the Wasatch when I visit, and his wife and 2 sons are there. They love Salt Lake. I'm also here off camera is Max Stoneman, and Max is a native of Salt Lake. He's our deputy press spokesman here. So Utah is well represented in the American mission in China. John, you've asked the key question. I'll just try to give you a very straight answer. Our relationship with the People's Republic of China is, I think, by far the most important that we have with any country in the world, given the level of competition and the level of interaction between our 2 economies in our two societies. And I'm sorry to say, I think the relationship is in very tough shape. It's a very difficult moment. If you think, you mentioned the Shanghai Agreement, President Nixon's historic trip to Beijing and Shanghai to meet Chairman Mao, to meet Zhou Enlai in February 1972. This might be the lowest moment since then. We have seemingly unremitting competition between us. We Americans don't believe that China's playing by the rules on economics and trade, and that's unfair to our businesses and our workers and to the American public and our economy. We certainly see China reaching out, pushing out for power against the United States militarily, in security realm, in the Indo-Pacific, pushing against our allies, Japan and South Korea and Australia and the Philippines and Thailand. We have a technological competition underway. And this is really for the future, for some of the younger people at your conference who are going to be leading us forward in the next few decades. You know, we have a competition underway in quantum sciences, in artificial intelligence, in machine learning, in biotechnology. These are the key industries for the future of the global economy. I think you and I would assume we're going to have commercial competition. That's fair. But the Chinese are seeking to militarize many of these technologies, and that presents a real challenge to us. And finally, and this is something that you put forward, so I think with so much resolve when you were ambassador, we Americans believe in democracy and the rule of law and freedom of the press and freedom of assembly and freedom of religion. And the government here does not. And we've seen that clash of values. We see it in Hong Kong, where the Chinese have snuffed out all the freedoms of the people of Hong Kong. We see it in Xinjiang province, where we believe a genocide has occurred against the Uyghur and other Muslim populations of Xinjiang. We see it in Tibet. And we see it in actions. The Chinese government censored Secretary Tony Blinken's speech that he gave 2 weeks ago, his very fine speech on the U.S. China relationship, where he said some welcoming things to the people of China, and yet it was censored. So across the board, if you think about that competition in those four areas I mentioned, economics, security, technology, and human rights, this is a profound division. And I think we feel it quite strongly in our mission that our job is to defend the United States, defend our people, defend our values and interests, and we try to do that to the best of our ability.
So our attendees are trying to decipher America's interests in China. And as you prepare to deploy, as you did several months ago, you get a chance to go through the interagency process. You talk to civil society, public, private sector leaders, and you kind of come up with a list of things that you think are priorities for the United States. And you've got a huge team. You might want to walk our audience through the footprint of your mission and associated consulates, because it's one of the largest footprints diplomatically anywhere in the world. But as you went through that process of consultations with people on Capitol Hill, people in executive branches, people in civil society, what did you come up with as some of the key U.S. priorities in the bilateral relationship?
Well, thank you, John. You're right. Just to tell people back in Utah at your conference about our mission, we are one of the largest, if not the largest, American diplomatic mission in the world. We have 46 U.S. government agencies here, everything from the State Department and Defense Department to the Food and Drug Administration, the Center for Disease Control, such as the interaction with the United States and China. We have consulates in Shanghai, and they've gone through a very tough time with a 2-month lockdown. They're just coming out of it. Guangzhou, of course, both of them so important to the economy of China, but also to the supply chain back to the United States. A consulate in Wuhan in central China, increasingly important there. Wuhan's a very important city. And a consulate up in Shenyang in northern China, which is our window into both North Korea and to Russia, in that northeast corner of China, abutting those two countries. So we're well represented here. I must say we have a terrific group of American public servants here, civilian and military. They're doing a wonderful job for our country, so I couldn't be prouder to lead that mission. I would think that we Americans have to balance a couple of things. We're in a largely competitive mode here. with the Chinese. And we have to meet that competition head on. And I think, John, when I went through confirmation, I had a lot of time to spend on Capitol Hill, met with a lot of Republican as well as Democratic members of the Senate and House, met with, of course, the Foreign Relations Committee for my confirmation hearing. I was really heartened. I was heartened by the degree of bipartisan consensus that China's vital to our interests, that we have to be willing to defend our interests with the Chinese, with the People's Republic government, that there may be some areas where we can collaborate and engage, and I hope there will be, and we can talk about that. There's not an identical views between the two political parties or between, say, conservatives and liberals, but there is, I think, a consensus that we're in a different mode now, that China has changed, that the Chinese government is much more assertive than it was 10 or 15 or 20 years ago against the interests of the United States, and that we need to be united as a country in facing it. And it won't shock you, John, you have such a long history in American politics as well as public service, that Republicans and Democrats don't agree on much these days on Capitol Hill, but they do agree on China, the importance of the United States putting its best foot forward. And I think that is a strength of our country because, of course, the Chinese are going to want to try to divide us at home. And we can't let that happen. The other thing I'd say is that we have a realization that we've got to invest in our own country to compete effectively with China. I think all of us feel, whether you're in Utah today, I'm from Massachusetts, we need to reinvest in the infrastructure of the United States. And it was good to see that bipartisan bill passed last autumn by the Congress, by the House and Senate. That is the largest infrastructure bill in a generation in our country to rebuild the roads and bridges and the internet systems in the country to reach rural communities, to make ourselves more competitive internationally. So I think that's one realization. It's probably the most important thing we can do to compete with China long term. Second, we also need to invest in our allies and align with them. And we're in a pretty strong position out here in the Indo-Pacific. President Biden just had, I think, a very successful trip here. He met the new South Korean president, and that president wants to get closer to the United States. We have probably with Japan now the strongest U.S.-Japan relationship in my memory, and I go back in the State Department to 1980 when I was an intern. And of course, we have with Australia in particular, in terms of our security and intelligence relationship, just pound for pound, one of our best allies in the world. And if you add our defense agreement, our defense treaty alliance with the Philippines and Thailand, and the fact that both Republican and Democratic administrations for 20 years now have been building a strategic U.S.-India partnership, I think that's probably the most effective way in terms of foreign and defense policy to face the Chinese. We don't want to go to war with China, God forbid. We don't want a conflict, but we need to stand up and protect our security and economic interests in this region. And our allies are helping us do that. And as they look at this increasingly aggressive China, our East Asia, our Indo-Pacific allies are really working with us. And the European Union, for the first time, is becoming very active in supporting us on many of these issues. So I think in that realm, investing inside the country, strengthening our alliances, and being willing to compete on a fair basis with the Chinese on all those issues we talked about, I think that's the essence of what President Biden's trying to do. I sense we have a lot of support from Capitol Hill, both parties, and that's a great thing for us.
So let's turn this question around and take a look at some of China's priorities in the U.S. China relationship. So what many of the audience will not know is you arrive in Beijing, you're credentialed as the chief of mission. You then start your round of consultations at a very senior level within the Chinese government. Sometimes they don't let you back in the door. I know I was frozen out repeatedly for different misdeeds, as I'm sure you're finding to be the case. But you have an opportunity to sit down with, for example, Xi Jinping and Yang Jiechi and Foreign Minister Wang Yi. So as you did that and you went through those meetings and consultations, what did you pick up as some of their priorities in the U.S. China relationship?
Well, those three particular meetings are ahead of me because one of the realities in China these days, John, is during the pandemic with the zero COVID policy of the Chinese government, I quarantined, my wife and I quarantined for the first 3 weeks. So we're just getting started here. But I think the Chinese, it's a central question. What are they trying to achieve? Their ambition is to become the strongest power in the Indo-Pacific. They think that's achievable. They are the leading trade partner of nearly every country in this region. They have an expanding military presence, a blue water navy, a sophisticated air force. And you see them in the Spratly and Paracel Islands of the South China Sea, in the Senkaku, Diaoyu Islands of the East China Sea, expanding their military presence, often in illegal ways, taking land, taking islands and islets and militarizing them against international law, but they're doing that. And they seem to be of the opinion that the East is rising and the West is falling, that China is strengthening and the United States is weakening. And that's that's an incorrect assumption on their part. I think actually we've been strengthening in the Indo-Pacific in recent years, but that's how the Chinese see things. They've seen the United States dominate this region in many ways since the close of the Second World War. And I think many Chinese officials believe it's their destiny to be that number one power. And then globally, John, I think maybe in the out decades, a decade or two or three from now, I think many Chinese officials harbor the ambition that China might become globally the most influential country in the world. And that's not something that the United States, the American people, other people who live in democracies want to see. That China's deeply authoritarian, increasingly repressive at home, but also increasingly, in some cases, a bully overseas. And so that's why we have to strengthen our partnerships and alliances. Again, not because we want to fight, we don't, but we want to defend what we have built, defend our security and economic and technology relationships out here in this incredibly expansive and important part of the world. I do think those are the goals of the Chinese leadership. And we have a beef often with how they proceed. The use of stealing of intellectual property, the use of the Chinese state to go after American and other companies here to the disadvantage of those companies, state subsidies, dumping. This has cost American jobs and it's cost American companies prosperity. And so there's another area where we have to stand up, and part of our mission here is to help American companies level the playing field and succeed. So very competitive relationship out here. And that's our main job in reacting to your question. What do the Chinese think they're doing? And again, the best way for the United States to do that is to be aligning with other countries. I'll just conclude on this, John. If you think about total global economic power, if you put the U.S. economy, we're still the largest economy in the world, the American economy, together in concert with Japan and the European Union, and we're increasingly working together. That's over 60% of global GDP. So China's going to have to respect that weight in economic terms, for instance, and that's a good way for the United States to proceed.
So there's been a lot of talk about decoupling. I'm not sure that anyone has made any sense of what that term actually means, but suffice it to say, the Chinese started decoupling a long time ago in their own right by picking state-owned winners, by stealing our intellectual property, by building their own indigenous domestic capacity through indigenous innovation and other means. And U.S. companies are hedging their bets, and by doing so, they are de facto decoupling as well. So we might have $1 trillion trading relationship that goes to, $500 billion, whatever it does. But a lot of supply chains run through China. There's a lot of heavy manufacturing that the United States does that is still in China. Plant property and equipment, stuff that you just can't pick up and move like you can with some aspects of technology trade. So where do you see this whole discussion on decoupling going? Is it real? And if so, how far does it actually go before it starts negatively impacting consumers in the United States and perhaps even some of our allies and friends and large trading partners in the Asia Pacific region, who are all kind of part of that trade matrix that has been built up over the last many decades?
Well, it is a central question, and I'm glad you've asked it. And I know you live the same reality that we're living here, thinking about this question. We have a symbiotic economic relationship with China. It's been built up over the last 40 years. And a couple of data points just to illustrate it. We have a $650 billion two-way U.S. China trade relationship. And if you think about what that means for Americans, think about, as you said, the supply chain. A lot of what we consume on a daily basis are lower priced goods that come from China. So in a way, good for the American consumer to be paying less for a product than they otherwise would. Think of the fact that last year, American farmers and American ranchers sold $38 billion worth of American agricultural products, ranch products to China. That's 1/5 of all U.S. agricultural exports around the world. So there's a degree of integration here that you just can't unravel easily. Government officials can't seek to do that because these are mainly private sector interactions. Think of our automobile industry. Ford and GM and Tesla all have major production facilities in the Shanghai region. There's a supplier network in southern China, central China, and that's critical to keeping American workers on the job. In the Midwest or in the South or in our big automobile manufacturing plants. That's another degree of interaction between us. So I don't think either side can just walk away from this economic relationship that's so important. These are the two largest economies in the world. But what do we see happening? I think you're right, Jon, in the way you posed your question. A lot of people accuse the United States of seeking to decouple. China's been the one leading the way. We see President Xi Jinping went to Hainan Island, southern China, last month, and he said the Chinese people should have Chinese rice in Chinese rice bowls. It's really a metaphor for what Xi Jinping is trying to do, and that is kind of look inward, develop the Chinese economy in such a way that it's no longer dependent on the United States or Japan or India or the EU for a large measure of its imports, of its trade. And I think the Chinese fear, they look what's happened at Russia, with Russia's barbaric invasion of Ukraine, the very effective international sanctions against Russia. China doesn't want to see that happen to themselves in some future scenario. So they're kind of burrowing inward. They're trying to reduce their dependence on supply chains. And they're particularly interested in making sure that they're not the prey of effective Western or international sanctions in the future. I do think they're leading the way. From our part, I'd say this. There are two areas where American businesses need to be careful and where the United States government has an absolute right to try to restrict trade. The one is when Chinese investors try to, say, buy up a company in the United States that might be part of a critical national resource, say in the semiconductor field, for instance. And now for 20 years, Republican and Democratic administrations have strengthened our ability to block those investments. So China can't come in through the back door, gain American technology from purchasing one of our companies, and use that technology against us in the military or intelligence realms. The second area is that there's, of course, a tremendous amount of American private investment from Wall Street, from hedge funds, private equity into the Chinese market, some of it quite productive and quite successful. But if American investors are investing, again, in areas of the Chinese economy that might help them in their national security competition with the United States, we should take a look at how to limit or restrict those types of investments. With those two caveats in mind, there's still a big space in the middle for American companies to compete here and to do well. But again, they need the active support of our federal government to interfere on their behalf with the Chinese when the Chinese don't play by the rules. And as you know, Jon, you were ambassador here, you saw it up close. The Chinese have been doing this for quite a long time, and it's time that we stood up to them on these unfair trade practices.
Nick, let's turn for a second to Russia-Ukraine. We've got time for just maybe a couple more questions. So put on your senior director cap from your NSC days when you managed that portfolio for the White House. and now your view from Beijing. So how is China watching this tragedy play out? And there's been a lot of talk about whether or not there are implications for Taiwan. In other words, will Beijing look at any kind of possible invasion of Taiwan differently? The unity of the Western free world, the international response, the global economic sanctions, which I think have been worked brilliantly. There's so much at play that nobody anticipated or expected. And I suspect in Beijing, they're looking at this, analyzing it very, very carefully, and factoring it into their longer term plans as it relates to Taiwan and any kind of so-called reunification plan. But how do you see that?
You know, I think that you remember, John, back on February 4th, the opening day of the Winter Olympics here in Beijing, President Xi Jinping and President Putin issued this long joint statement, essentially saying there's a new partnership between the two, and it has no limits. Remember that phrase. And 20 days later, the Russian Federation launched its illegal invasion of Ukraine. I think the Chinese are in a very uncomfortable position. Half the time when you look at what the Chinese are saying is they say we're for peace and we're not for this war. But then you look at the rhetorical support that the Chinese have consistently given the Russians since the start of the invasion of Ukraine. They've been saying a couple of things that are really quite frankly outrageous about the United States. The Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson has said consistently, you know, NATO drove Putin to invade Ukraine, which is a ludicrous proposition. And second, they've been making this preposterous claim that the United States had bioweapons labs in Ukraine. These are lies. But in an authoritarian state system like this, sometimes you get those, you know, that's how people deal with public issues. I think the Chinese are uncomfortable. It's hard to defend President Putin here. A hallmark of Chinese statecraft since the beginning of the People's Republic back in 1949 is that China believes, maybe if you listen to the Chinese, in territorial integrity and sovereignty, that no other country has a right to interfere in the internal affairs of another. Well, Vladimir Putin has done a lot more than that in invading Ukraine, killing so many people, 7 million refugees, the barbaric bombing of civilians. And I think the Chinese don't have a good answer here for why they've stuck by the Russians so long and about this no limits partnership. We're in a stronger position because you remember the vote in the United Nations. 141 countries in the United Nations voted to denounce the Russian invasion of Ukraine back in March. Most days you can't get 141 nations in the General Assembly of the UN to say the sky is blue, but they did in this case. And so I do think the Chinese are on the back foot here. And frankly, in our conversations with them, they just don't have a lot of good answers to, and they kind of swing wildly back and forth between outright support of Russia and saying that they want peace in Ukraine. It's not been a very convincing performance.
One of the things, Nick, that I've long admired about you is your willingness to speak openly about human rights. It seems that everywhere you go, that's part of your discourse. And people listen when somebody like you, with your kind of background and level of experience, speaks out about human rights. And it's important in China to do that. So I know it's a tough thing to do in your position in Beijing. I always found myself speaking to empty hallways whenever I bring up human rights, and oftentimes attacked and retaliated against, and sometimes banned from social media, whatever. But how do you measure progress on human rights these days in China? And what do you see as maybe even signs of success at this point?
You know, I must say there's not a lot of optimism here, and I don't see many signs of successes at all. In fact, I'd say the situation is going backwards. It's being more repressive. If you think about the fact that Hong Kong, as recently as 3 years ago, people exercised. You remember the June 2019, this peaceful civil protests in the streets of Hong Kong. People came out by the millions to stand up for human freedom, for freedom of speech, for instance. That's been all snuffed out. We're just approaching at the end of this month the 25th anniversary of the handover from Hong Kong, from the United Kingdom to the People's Republic. I happened to be there that day with Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, when I was State Department spokesperson. We felt, the Chinese said at that time there'll be 50 years of essentially autonomy for the people of Hong Kong to rule themselves, that's all been snuffed out. All the freedoms have disappeared from the streets of Hong Kong. It's a great tragedy. And we've talked about Tibet and the ongoing repression there, and the outright repression of up to 1 million people in Xinjiang province in northwest China. The Uyghur population has been imprisoned, incarcerated, sent to these, re-education facilities. It's kind of an Orwellian name for a prison. And so we do have an obligation to speak out about these issues. I have taken to the Chinese government lists of people who we believe, Chinese citizens, have been imprisoned unfairly, convicted unfairly, who are champions of human rights. There's a young man named Nuri Turkal. He's the vice chairman of the U.S. Commission on Religious Freedom. He's a member of our government. He can't go back to Xinjiang, where he was born. His mother, who recently lost her husband, Nuri's father, can't travel to the United States to see her son and grandchildren. And their situation is replicated in hundreds of thousands of Uyghur families. And so we try to stand up for them. And as you know, John, you try to conduct this conversation effectively. It's mostly can be effective, I think, behind closed doors, but there are times when we have to speak up. And so just last Saturday, on June 4th, the 33rd anniversary of the Tiananmen uprising, Secretary Tony Blinken issued a written statement telling the truth about what happened at Tiananmen. The Chinese government didn't like it at all. But that's what we have to do as Americans, is stand up for our values.
Well, Nick, I respect what you do. And I have to say, the most important work I ever did. I mean, as you know, you meet a lot of high-flying people. You attend a lot of important meetings. You have important conversations and engage in meaningful dialogue. But the most important things I ever did were, among them, visiting Americans in prison who had been imprisoned without cause. Meeting with people in Xinjiang who were frightened of their government and who were being pursued, had nowhere to turn. Going out to Tibet and meeting with religious leaders in Tibet who would pull me aside as a United States ambassador with tears in their eyes, thanking America for standing by their side. I mean, these are things that I can barely articulate to American audiences without getting emotional, but it's sometimes the most important work that an American ambassador, a U.S. envoy, does in a place like China.
I think you're right. There are 1,000 issues out here, and we try to work all of them on behalf of the American people. But ultimately, John, I think you're right, and you did this so brilliantly as ambassador. There are times when you have to stand up and just say, we disagree. We respectfully disagree, and you have to stand with those people who are being subjugated. And that's a big part of what's happening here in China. I would say this, we've talked about the mainline effort here, and that is to hold our ground, to compete, to protect our businesses, to protect our national security. We are also the 2 largest countries in the world, so we have some mutual obligations to the rest of the world. So we are working fairly well together on climate change. John Kerry, our climate change negotiator, the president's special representative, working very effectively with his Chinese counterpart, number one. Number two, the Chinese were not transparent about what happened at Wuhan in January and February of 2020. But, when the next pandemic appears at some point in the future, and the odds are we'll have another one of some different sort, we're going to have to work with China because they do have tremendous capacity, and we have to work globally. And there's another issue that I think people in Utah will resonate with people in Utah as it does in my home state of Massachusetts, and that is that we lost 110,000 Americans to drug overdoses in the 12-month period of 2021 and into the beginning of 2022. 70% of them were fentanyl, a synthetic opioid overdose. Most of the precursor chemicals, most of the fentanyl comes from precursor chemicals shipped illegally by Chinese companies in the black market into the drug cartels in Mexico and Central America. So I'm trying to work very hard with the Chinese government to convince them to shut off the flow by their black market companies of those precursor chemicals to Mexico, so that we can save American lives. So as we compete with China, and sometimes we knock heads and have profound disagreements, we also have to have some room to engage with China, to work with China, to collaborate. That's the reality of how the world works. And on this issue of fentanyl, we've just got to hopefully convince the Chinese government to help us resolve this problem in the United States, because it's affecting everybody, every state in the union. I'm sure you're dealing with it in Utah as we are in my part of the country.
Nick, last question. So later this year, the major confab, the 20th Party Congress, will take place. These are always big deals. They're on a 5-year schedule. It's when the new slate of leaders, certainly for the Politburo, the Central Committee, and the Standing Committee of the Politburo, are generally put forward. What's going to happen this go around that is so unusual is Xi Jinping will be put in for an unprecedented third term as head of the Communist Party. It's almost like, why can't they find anyone in the younger generation to step forward? Or is it just an effort to kind of solidify authoritarian control, both within the party and certainly within the military ranks and beyond? Any sense as to what the headlines might be coming out of the 20th Party Congress later this year?
Well, that's the key question. This is an opaque system. It's not a system that's at all transparent. It's nothing like, Washington, D.C., which is an open book and should be as a democracy. It's very difficult to discern what's happening inside the inner realms of the government here. But I think it's reasonable to assume that this trend that we've been seeing for the past 5 to 10 years of increasing authoritarianism, of increasing power of the Communist Party here in Chinese life, will mean that Xi Jinping will very likely have a third 5-year term voted at the 20th Party Congress. That'll be then solidified in a March Congress in 2023. And he's very likely going to be governing this country for the next 5 years and perhaps even beyond. As you know, John, since Deng Xiaoping's historic reforms, there have been an unwritten rule that an understanding that no president, general secretary of the Communist Party would serve more than 2 terms, more than 10 years. Well, that appears to be, that'll be broken. And there'll be a third 5-year term, most reasonably, I think, or most likely, I guess I should say. And then, of course, there are 7 individuals who sit on the Standing Committee. That's the key decision-making body of the party. And it'll be interesting to see who are those people, who leaves and who comes on. So that's part of the drama that's happening this year. And it may well be driving a lot of what we're seeing. The adherence to the zero COVID policy here. We are tested every other day and have been for months. Beijing was locked down for a good 5 weeks. Shanghai was locked down for more than 2 months. And as the virus comes and goes, this country is in the vice of, in the grip of a very, very organized system to limit our ability to travel across the country, to get on trains or airplanes. A lot of people in Shanghai couldn't leave their apartments for more than 60 days. This is the way the Chinese have decided to play this. It's caused some real harm to the economy here in the short term, and thus harm to the supply chains back to the United States. It's fueling some of the inflationary problems in the United States. And so you can see the impact that this country is having on the rest of the world just because of its sheer power. Another reason why we need to be at full strength out here in the American mission to represent our own interests and our own values.
Nick, we are so grateful to you. Grateful for your time, grateful for your leadership. I've said it before and I'm going to say it again. You're the most talented diplomat of my generation, which would be your generation too. And we're just very, very grateful for your public service. Now managing the most difficult and complex, the most challenging bilateral relationship we have in the world, with elements of competition, elements of collaboration, and increasingly with a whole lot of confrontation. And it's how we kind of work the in-between in avoiding war and conflict that really is your work. And we thank you for it. We thank you for joining the World Trade Center gathering here at the China Summit. And we hope we can stay in contact. And please tell all great Utahns who are working as part of your mission, hello, that they are appreciated by all those on the home front.
I appreciate that. We have a big contingent from Utah here in the American Mission. I'm going to pass on, we have a country team meeting in about an hour, John. I'm going to pass on your wishes to them. And next year, maybe I can be with you in Utah. That would be a good thing. But all best for your conference. And again, I just want to thank you, Jon, for your leadership in so many realms. It's deeply appreciated.
Thank you, Nick. Such a pleasure to be with you. We'll see you soon.
You bet. Thank you.